For countries like Canada and Australia, where does all of this leave us? Well, rather different for Canada and Australia. For Canada, the question is, do we matter enough to either China or India to matter to them at all? And this is a question that comes up in Canada quite a lot these days. Both countries are very interested in Canada's natural resources, as they are in Australia's natural resources. In the case of Canada, they're both also interested in investing in Canada because it's part of North American economic space, and they gain access to the U.S. market through their Canadian operations. They're very interested, of course, in both cases, but particularly India's case, in uranium. Australia has said it won't sell uranium to India. Canada has said, curiously, because it held out for longer than Australia did in its relationship with India, Canada has said it will. Australia and Canada get to play with the big boys in the G20. We don't yet know whether that amounts to anything real and whether the G20 is a lasting phenomenon or whether it's a transitional arrangement. I suspect the latter, and I suspect something smaller will emerge eventually. And actually, the chances of Australia being part of that something smaller would have to be at least as good as Canada's, arguably, because Mexico may well be part of that smaller grouping, and they may figure, why do we need all three members of NAFTA? But all of that is unknowable. The world has changed very fast with the economic crisis accelerating, trends that were already underway, such that we do pay attention to India and China today, very belatedly in the case of India. We don't know as much about India as we should, although I'm delighted that the Lowy Institute has done as much as it has admirably on India, bringing some of the very best Indians to share their views with audiences here in Sydney. One example of how the world has changed is that India and China belong to lots of international groupings that neither Australia or Canada do, and we never will, and they couldn't care less. The BRIC organization, artificial because Brazil, Russia, India, and China include three emerging or re-emerging countries and one in actual decline. But nevertheless, it's been meaningful enough for them to launch BRIC summits. The first was in Russia last year, and the second is going on in Brazil right now. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization about Central Asia. India is an observer, as is Pakistan and Iran, but of course countries like ours are nowhere there. An important partnership from India's point of view, India, Brazil, South Africa, IPSA, described as a grouping of the leading democracies of their respective continents, in which the private sectors of each are investing quite a bit, and the leaders of each have invested a lot of their own credibility. BASIC, the group of 4 countries that dealt with the United States in Copenhagen, cutting a deal from which the Europeans and the rest of us were absent. A reminder that the United States is perfectly willing to deal with whoever it is convenient to deal with, and that won't always be us. And sometimes BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, plus Mexico. We tend not to notice Mexico in the picture, but we Canadians follow Mexico perhaps a bit more closely. So all of this is worth monitoring, and it's exciting to monitor. Lowy has demonstrated a tremendous commitment to Asia. It's known for it in the community of high-quality think tanks. So all of you living in Sydney, I think, are extremely well positioned to form your own views in this area in years to come. In sum, can India and China share a mountain? Yes, but only very gingerly. The relationship will remain competitive, and Tibet remains a wild card, particularly with the inevitable passing of the Dalai Lama, likely to introduce a period of rather sharp tension between the two countries over succession to the Dalai Lama and possibly some other dimensions of the Tibet file. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll look forward to your own remarks and any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for that very thought-provoking presentation. One element that I think you touched on, but obviously with the constraints of time didn't go into much detail on, is the potentially competitive strategic relationship between China and India in the years to come. And I'd be interested in any views you could share about what you see as the potential for India in the Asian strategic environment if, as we assume, Chinese power continues to grow, and if there is seen by some countries in the region to be a need to balance or check Chinese power. What do you see India's role in that scenario?
Great, Rory. Thank you very much, because it is an important dimension for both countries. Again, India is very much at a disadvantage vis-à-vis China when it comes to actual military matters as opposed to thinking about them. Indian governments have never spent much on the military in India. Somewhere between 2 and 3% is the historic norm, whereas we're not quite clear on how much China is spending, but probably a bit more than that. Secondly, the Indian Army is tied down with all sorts of internal security duties from its very significant military installations in Kashmir, several other separatist insurgencies in the northeast, a huge Maoist insurgency affecting much of the center of the country and the east of the country, none of which, by the way, is good for the Indian Army. Internal security duties are always the enemy of high-quality armies. India's outstanding branch of the military is the Navy. It's relatively small, and the very proud cadre of Indian Navy people basically have dinky toys to play with. But those dinky toys are improving. The Indian government is actually investing quite a lot in the Navy. And that is germane to your question about what role geostrategically can India play. India has, after many years of shunning just about everybody and sounding morally superior to the rest of us, has engaged energetically with all comers, all Navy comers, including Australia. Even distant Canada got to participate in one of the Malabar exercises off India's coast. So I think naval cooperation in the Indian mind, in the Chinese mind also, I should add, extremely important. India feels increasingly encircled by China. There's a sort of parlor game that goes on amongst geostrategic types around the metaphor of encirclement. And it's true that China has built or invested in naval installations that form a sort of ring around India, starting with Burma. There may soon be one in Bangladesh. They have developed a very large port in Sri Lanka, and they have also developed the port of Gwadar in Pakistan. And an American strategist a few years ago described this as China's string of pearls strategy, which strikes terror in Indian hearts. But actually, if you look at it from a Beijing perspective, who's encircling who? Because China often feels threatened by talk of groupings involving the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. So encirclement can be played by more than one actor, and I wouldn't suggest wasting too much time on this because it does come down to, in my view, geostrategic parlor games. What is true is that the Indian Ocean is of huge strategic importance, as are waterways leading to it, like the Malacca Straits. Africa is of great importance to both India and China as a source of resources. And so a degree of shared presence in the Indian Ocean is increasingly going to be inevitable for India, even if it doesn't like China's company in the area. Interestingly, both countries are participating in the anti-piracy coalition off the Somali coast, and that isn't a coincidence. So thank you very much for that, Rory.
Thank you. Chris Skinner, just to follow on from that, but from more of an energy perspective. China, I think, has stated that it has a very legitimate interest in the Indian Ocean because it relies so much on oil from the Middle East. I don't know what India's position in that regard. I wonder if you'd care to comment.
Well, thank you. China and India, more counterintuitively in the case of China in a way, really have relied on markets to intermediate access to natural resources. And of course, the biggest oil market is the Gulf. And so inevitably, the Chinese need access to the Gulf. Indeed, their relationship with a number of Gulf actors is a delicate one for them, because while they have a reasonably good relationship with Iran, that indisposes actively countries on the southern tier of the Gulf. Likewise, talk of pipelines that run possibly through Pakistan to the southern waters that could feed China in due course indisposes other actors in the area. Middle East diplomacy is important and difficult for both India and China. I'll argue in my book that it's the single thing that Indian diplomacy has been best at over the years, unnoticed by any of us or many of us in the West, because India actually has good to excellent relations with virtually every country in the Middle East, including a very significant relationship with Israel that India's Arab friends have come to accept. So is China a reality in the Persian Gulf? Is it there? Does India object to it? India doesn't object to it because China so patently requires that access. But there is competition for resources. It's market-based competition for resources. And in Africa, we see the differences between the two countries. In Africa, China is operating as China Inc., moving in and securing resources as a state. India is letting its private sector do its thing. The Indian economy, it would be easy to forget, is actually a market economy. And while the government of India interferes every now and then, private sector actors make up their own minds as to where they're going to invest and where they're going to search for access to resources. And my bet would be that China's begun stubbing its toe already in Africa in one or two places. I think its approach, which has the advantage of being very dynamic and focused, will lead it into a number of conflicts with a number of Africans, whereas the Indian more cautious, more market-driven approach, I think, is less likely to be controversial over time. But meanwhile, Indians worry a lot, as usual, about China stealing a march on them, perhaps.
Fiona Cunningham. David, you concluded that the relationship between China and India is likely to remain competitive, with Tibet being something of a wild card. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on how that competition and indeed that Tibet wild card is likely to play out in the nuclear field.
I'm not sure that once India achieved a degree of nuclear parity with China, nuclear competition is terribly important between the two. India is reported to have quite a large number of explosive devices and the missile technology necessary to deliver them. China, likewise. I think it's highly unlikely the two countries will get into an uncontrolled war of a type that would lead to the use of nuclear weapons, just as I think it's less likely that India and Pakistan will have a nuclear exchange than might be feared on the face of it. So I don't think the nuclear angle is where their competition is going to play out. I think it's going to play out on resources. I think it's going to play out on economic factors. I think it's going to play out on who Asians, who other Asian countries are drawn to and investing in. The nuclear angle strikes me particularly perhaps at a time when Obama is reminding us all that the priority for everybody should be to ratchet down on nuclear rather than up. It seems to me that that's not all that major, although for those who study nuclear thought in both countries, my view may be a highly superficial one. It's more intuitive than deeply studied.
Do you see either, you've talked about both countries going ahead pretty much in a sort of a linear way with their development, economic growth and so on. Do you see any risk to either country, leaving aside things like another global financial crash, but internal risks to either country's pattern of growth?
Well, the miracle in India is, first of all, that the country cohered at all during the years that Nehru was its first prime minister post-independence, because there was a great deal present in Indian society at the time that could have torn the country apart. Indeed, very few Western observers, if you go back and read what people in the West were writing in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, expected India to survive within its present borders. So I think India does face significant threats to its cohesion, but my intuition again is that it will muddle through. There is a great deal India itself could do to mitigate these threats. The Indian Prime Minister always says, rightly, whenever he's asked, that the Maoist insurgency is a rebuke to New Delhi, that New Delhi has not been good at providing services to far-flung corners of India. It has not been good at protecting the rights of India's tribal people, and it's essentially the tribal people who have rallied to the Maoists. So this is something India could easily have prevented and could still, I would argue, relatively easily solve if action were to follow endless talk in Delhi about the Maoist insurgency, which Mr. Singh, or Dr. Singh, I should say, at one point described as the gravest security threat to India, I think rightly. In Kashmir, for example, India could de-link how it deals with Indian Kashmir from the non-stop and generally unproductive discussions with Pakistan. India's attitude has been that it's not going to do much for or about Kashmir until it has a deal with Pakistan on it. But precisely because New Delhi insists that Indian Kashmiris must be Indian, it'd be nice to treat them as Indian citizens and to stop treating them as a people under an incompetent and often brutal military occupation. That's something India could do on its own, having nothing to do with Pakistan. Indeed, it might show up Pakistan and the way that Azad Kashmir is governed in Pakistan. I understand that there are some military risks with a more imaginative approach to Kashmir by New Delhi, but they strike me as small. So India has it within its reach to resolve most of its internal security problems, it seems to me. China is very worried about its soft borders, as it sees them, Tibet and Xinjiang. And that's been a problem, by the way, for Pakistan over the last year or so in its relationship with India. It's the most enduring major alliance I can think of. It's been in place since 1955, the close ties between Pakistan and China. But without being under any overt strain, clearly the proliferation of terrorists out of Pakistan is of great concern to China because it fears Islamic extremism of various sorts within its borders. There is virtually nothing to back up those fears, but it's nevertheless a fear deeply held in Beijing. So I think each country has more or less real threats to its cohesion. I think in China, the real threat to stability isn't the hinterlands breaking away. It's whether the political model of China is going to prove too brittle to survive growing prosperity. In India, where politics are often shocking and fairly corrupt mess, and chaos is the norm, the political system is actually very stable. Everybody's unhappy with the politicians, so every 5 years they get to throw the bums out, and 5 years later you start all over again. So in terms of macro stability, I'd bet on India rather than China, mainly because I think in China, whether the communist regime can adapt to a changing China or whether the political system will break as China's growth accelerates is something that to me is just completely unknowable.
I think on that note, couldn't think of a better one. We'll end because we're right on time. I apologize to everybody who had questions. You may be able to ask David before he leaves. So I'd like to thank David for a very, very eloquent and thought-provoking presentation on a Friday lunchtime. And it definitely was a distinguished speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you.